Two bodies found floating in Pine Lake, Michigan. A father and son who went fishing on what should have been a perfect Sunday morning in 1994. The case was closed within hours, ruled an accidental drowning. But 30 years later, when the lake's water level drops to its lowest point in history, something emerges from the murky depths that changes everything. What they pulled from that lake wasn't just metal and debris. It was evidence that had been waiting 3 decades to surface. Evidence that would rewrite the official story of David and Marcus Chen's death. Evidence that would expose a web of debt, desperation, and cold-blooded murder. Pine Lake, Michigan, September 18, 1994. The morning sun cast golden reflections across the still water as 38-year-old David Chen loaded his small aluminum fishing boat with gear. The tackle box clinked softly as David placed it in the bottom of the boat. Beside him, 10-year-old Marcus bounced on his toes with excitement, his new fishing rod gripped tightly in small hands. The boy had been asking for this trip for weeks, ever since school started again after summer break. "Can we catch the big one today, Dad?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying across the quiet marina. David forced a smile. "We'll see what's biting, buddy." But David's mind wasn't on fishing. It was on the 3 men who had visited his house the night before. Men with hard faces and harder voices. Men who had made it very clear that his 2-week extension was up. The boat motor sputtered to life, breaking the morning silence. David guided them away from the dock, past the no swimming signs and the scattered lily pads that floated like green coins on the surface. Marcus chattered about school, about his friends, about the $20 bill his grandmother had given him for his birthday. What Marcus didn't know was that $20, along with everything else in David's wallet, had already been promised to people who didn't accept late payments. They anchored near the center of the lake, where the water was deepest and the fish were supposed to be plentiful. Marcus cast his line with the clumsy enthusiasm of a child, while David sat in the stern, checking his watch every few minutes. He was supposed to meet them at 2 p.m. Tommy Volkov and his associates from the Red Corner Social Club. They'd given him until today to come up with the $15,000 he owed from a poker game that had gone very, very wrong. David had thought he was smart. He'd thought he could parlay his small winnings into enough to cover his debts. Instead, he'd dug himself deeper, borrowing from people who measured interest in broken bones and measured patience in days, not weeks. "Dad, look." Marcus held up his line, empty hook spinning in the sunlight. "I think I had one, but it got away." "Keep trying," David said, but his voice was distant. The morning passed slowly. A few small fish, nothing worth keeping. Marcus grew restless, eventually pulling out a small notebook and pencil from his backpack. He'd been keeping a journal for school, writing about their weekend adventures. "What are you writing?" David asked. "Just about today," Marcus said, not looking up from his careful lettering. "Mrs. Patterson says we should write down important things so we remember them." Important things. David wondered what his son considered important about this day. The early morning drive to the lake, the pancakes they'd shared at the diner, the way the mist had rolled across the water like smoke. Or maybe Marcus had noticed more than David realized. Maybe he'd seen the men who had been parked across the street from their house for the past 3 days. Maybe he'd heard the whispered phone conversations David thought he'd hidden. At 11:30, David made a decision. He started the motor and headed back toward shore, but not to the main marina. Instead, he guided them to a secluded cove on the lake's north side, where dense pine trees grew right up to the water's edge. "Why are we stopping here?" Marcus asked, looking up from his notebook. "I need to make a phone call," David said. "There's better reception here." It was a lie. David's phone had been disconnected 3 days ago, but as they approached the shore, David saw them. 2 men standing in the shadows between the trees, waiting. One of them raised his hand in a slow wave that wasn't friendly. David's blood turned to ice water. They weren't supposed to meet until later. They weren't supposed to come here. Tommy Volkov stepped out of the trees, his expensive shoes crunching on the pine needles and fallen leaves. He was a thick-set man with graying hair and eyes like chips of flint. Behind him, his nephew Peter emerged from the shadows, younger and hungrier, the kind of man who enjoyed his work. "David," Tommy called across the water, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Bring the boy and come ashore. We need to talk." Marcus looked up from his notebook, suddenly alert. "Dad?" Who are those men? David's hand tightened on the motor's throttle. For a wild moment, he considered running, gunning the engine and heading for the opposite shore, for the main marina where there would be people, witnesses, safety. But Tommy was already walking along the shoreline, parallel to the boat. Peter was pulling something from his jacket. Not a gun, David realized with sick certainty, but a phone, probably with photos, probably of Linda, David's wife, leaving her job at the bank, or of Marcus walking to school that morning. David, Tommy's voice carried a note of warning now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The boat drifted closer to shore, close enough for David to see the details he'd been trying not to notice. The fresh scratches on Tommy's knuckles, the way Peter kept checking his watch like they had a schedule to keep. Marcus closed his notebook and tucked it into his backpack, along with the pencil. Dad, what's happening? It's okay, David said, but his voice cracked. Just some friends of Daddy's. But as the boat scraped against the muddy shore, David caught sight of something that made his heart stop completely. Shovels. 2 of them, leaning against a tree just behind where the men stood. The blades were clean, but the handles were worn smooth like they'd been used recently. Tommy waded into the shallow water, his hand extended to help David out of the boat. Come on, David, let's discuss your payment plan. What happened next was recorded only in Marcus's notebook, found 30 years later in a waterproof bag that had somehow survived decades at the bottom of Pine Lake. The entry, written in a child's careful handwriting, began. The men said Daddy owed them money. They said he had to come with them to get it. I told Daddy I was scared, but he said everything would be okay. The next line was different, the pencil marks heavier, more frantic. Something's wrong. Daddy's crying. The big man has a rope. And then, in letters that grew increasingly shaky, they're putting us back in the boat. The big man is pushing us out to the deep water. Daddy can't swim very good. Neither can I. The final entry was barely legible. The boat is rocking. Water coming in. I think they made holes in it. I'm scared. I'm putting this notebook in the bag Mom gave me for camping. Maybe someone will find it. The official police report, filed 2 days later when the bodies washed ashore, was brief and conclusive. David Chen, 38, and his son Marcus, 10, had drowned when their aluminum fishing boat capsized in Pine Lake. The boat was found overturned in deep water, no signs of foul play. Accidental death by drowning, case closed. But Linda Chen never accepted that verdict. She knew her husband was a gambling man. She knew he'd been worried about money, making nervous phone calls, jumping every time a car drove slowly past their house. She'd begged him not to take Marcus on that fishing trip, some sixth sense warning her that something was wrong. The police had listened to her concerns with professional sympathy and done nothing. David's gambling debts weren't secret, but they weren't considered relevant to what appeared to be a straightforward boating accident. Accidents happened, people drowned, especially people who, according to the marina owner, had never been strong swimmers. For 30 years, Linda carried her suspicions like stones in her chest. She became a police officer herself, partly from a desire to understand how investigations really worked, partly from a need to believe that justice was possible, even when it came too late. She retired in 2020, after 25 years on the force. But she never stopped thinking about Pine Lake, about the questions that had never been answered, about the way Tommy Volkov had showed up at David's funeral with flowers and condolences that felt like mockery. The drought of 2024 was the worst Michigan had seen in 50 years. Pine Lake's water level dropped to historic lows, exposing shoreline that hadn't been visible since the lake was first created in the 1960s. Boat launches that had been underwater for decades suddenly emerged like the ribs of some massive skeleton. It was a metal detector enthusiast named Gary Hoffman who found the first piece, a corroded aluminum fragment recognizably part of a boat's hull. He called the sheriff's department more out of curiosity than alarm. But when the Marine unit arrived with their sonar equipment, they found something more interesting. The boat's remnants weren't scattered randomly across the lake bottom as they would be after an accidental sinking. They were concentrated in one area, weighed down with what appeared to be concrete blocks. And then they found the bag. Waterproof, military surplus, the kind hikers use to protect their gear in wet conditions. Inside, impossibly preserved, were Marcus Chen's notebook, 3 pencils, a $20 bill, and a disposable camera with 12 photos still undeveloped. Linda Chen got the call on a Tuesday morning in late September, exactly 30 years after her husband and son had died. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had taken over the cold case division, spoke carefully, professionally, but Linda could hear the undercurrent of excitement in her voice. "Mrs. Chen, we've found some evidence related to your husband and son's case, evidence that suggests their deaths may not have been accidental." Linda sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, staring out the window at the bird feeder David had hung there the spring before he died. "What kind of evidence? I'd rather show you in person if that's okay. Can you come to the station this afternoon?" The photographs, when developed, told a story that made Linda's blood run cold. 12 pictures, taken by a 10-year-old boy in the last hours of his life. The early shots showed normal fishing trip scenes, the boat, the lake, David baiting hooks and checking lines. But the later photos were different. Shots taken from inside the boat, looking toward shore. 2 men visible between the trees. Close-up shots, as if Marcus had been trying to document something he knew was important. One photo showed a license plate, partially obscured by branches but still readable. The plate belonged to a 1993 Buick registered to Peter Volkov. Tommy Volkov had died in 2018, liver cancer taking him slowly and painfully in a hospice outside Detroit. But his nephew Peter was still alive, still living in the same house, still occasionally visiting the Red Corner Social Club that had been the center of his uncle's operations. When Detective Martinez knocked on Peter Volkov's door on October 3, 2024, she carried with her 30 years of accumulated evidence. Marcus's notebook, the photographs, testimony from Linda Chen about David's gambling debts and her husband's fear in the days before his death. Peter answered the door in a bathrobe and slippers, a 70-year-old man whose hands shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. He looked nothing like the hard young man who had stood in the shadows at Pine Lake 3 decades earlier. "Mr. Volkov, I'm Detective Martinez with the county police. I'd like to talk to you about David Chen." Peter's face went very still. "Who?" "David Chen. He died in 1994, along with his son Marcus, at Pine Lake." For a long moment, Peter said nothing. Then he set down his coffee cup and invited her inside. What happened in that living room over the next 3 hours would finally close the case that had haunted Linda Chen for 30 years. Peter Volkov, facing the weight of evidence that had literally risen from the depths of Pine Lake, made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. He confessed. Not to murder, he was careful to clarify, to manslaughter. To a plan that had gone wrong, to a message that was supposed to scare David Chen, but had instead killed him and his innocent son. "Tommy wanted to make a point," Peter told Detective Martinez, his voice barely above a whisper. "David owed money, a lot of money. We were supposed to rough him up a little, take him for a ride, let him know what would happen if he didn't pay. But the boy was there. We didn't know about the boy. Tommy was furious. We couldn't just let them go after they'd seen us, but we couldn't." Peter's voice trailed off. "So you decided to make it look like an accident?" Peter nodded slowly. "We damaged the boat. Just small holes, supposed to take on water slowly. We figured they'd make it most of the way back to shore, have to swim the last bit. David knew how to swim, we thought. And kids, they're natural swimmers, right? But David Chen hadn't been a strong swimmer. And Marcus, despite his father's optimistic assumptions, had never learned to swim at all. The boat had sunk faster than expected, in deeper water than planned. By the time Peter and Tommy realized what was happening, it was too late to help. They watched from shore as David struggled to keep his son afloat, watched as exhaustion and panic took them both under the gray surface of Pine Lake. "We never meant for it to happen like that," Peter said, tears running down his weathered cheeks. Tommy had nightmares about it for years, used to wake up screaming about the kid. But guilt hadn't been enough to make them come forward. Fear of prosecution, of admitting to a crime that had spiraled far beyond their intentions, had kept them silent for 3 decades. It was only the drought, the dropping water levels, the inexorable exposure of long-buried secrets that had finally forced the truth to surface. Peter Volkov was arrested and charged with 2 counts of manslaughter. At his age, with his failing health, even a conviction would likely mean he'd die in prison. but he seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth, to lift the weight he'd carried for 30 years. Linda Chen attended every day of the trial. She sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, and watched as the evidence she'd waited 3 decades to see was finally presented to a jury. The notebook entries, read aloud in Marcus's innocent voice. The photographs, blown up and displayed on screens around the courtroom. The testimony of marine experts who explained how the boat had been deliberately sabotaged. When the verdict came back, guilty on both counts, Linda felt something she hadn't experienced since 1994. Not closure, exactly, but something close to it. The certainty that the truth had finally surfaced, like evidence rising from the depths of a drained lake. Outside the courthouse, Detective Martinez asked Linda how she felt. "Like I can finally visit their graves without feeling like I failed them," Linda said quietly. Like Marcus's notebook was worth something after all. The Pine Lake case made national headlines, becoming a symbol of how old crimes could be solved by new technology, changing circumstances, and the persistent pursuit of justice. The story of a child's notebook preserved in murky water for 30 years, waiting for drought and determination to bring it back to light. But for Linda Chen, it was simpler than that. It was the story of a father and son who had gone fishing on a Sunday morning and never came home. A story that had finally, after 3 decades of silence, found its voice. The Red Corner Social Club closed 6 months after Peter Volkov's conviction. The building was demolished, replaced by a small park with a bench overlooking Pine Lake. A plaque on the bench reads, "In memory of David and Marcus Chen and all victims whose stories wait to be told." Linda Chen visits that bench every September 18th. She brings 2 fishing rods and sits for an hour, watching the water and remembering the sound of her son's laughter, the way her husband used to whistle while he tied fishing knots, the morning they left her kitchen for the last time. The lake is full again now, winter rains and spring snowmelt having restored it to normal levels. But Linda knows that somewhere beneath those peaceful waters, the truth is always waiting, ready to surface when the time is right, ready to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves.